Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Downs. Welcome to another episode from Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. We're in Module 3 right now, and I'm just copying the video URL over to the Activity Center. Starting a wee bit early today, but by the time I'm set up, that means we'll be starting on time. And the reason for that is I have a presentation coming up in a webinar at 12:45, so I'm going to have to keep things certainly on time for this particular presentation. So, okay, I've published it in the Activity Center, and we're about to begin the presentation itself. So I know that those slides are too big, so I'll make them a bit smaller and a bit narrower. There we go. So, maybe too small, eh? The subject for today is when analytics works. And what I'd like to talk about is a set of ethical issues that arises not as a result of failures of analytics, but as a result of the success of analytics. Modern AI isn't like old AI. Old AI was based on rules, and you had expert systems, and it proved to be pretty much impossible to come up with enough rules to cover all the situations. That's a lesson that should be learned in our current inquiry about ethics in analytics, but we'll come back to that. Modern analytics works by finding patterns in data and then doing things with that. Reporting, doing analysis, creating new things, creating chat applications, whatever. We've seen a whole range of applications. I think there's no question that it does work. We might question it around the edges. Does it do this particular thing? Does it do that particular thing? Although more and more the answer even to that sort of question is yes, it does. As it gets bigger, as it gets faster, it does do these things that we used to think could only be done by humans. Now, a lot of the criticisms of analytics and AI, a lot of the ethical issues that arise, point to the way that this process can be done incorrectly. And of course, one of the biggest ones that comes up time and time again is the issue of bias in artificial intelligence, data sets, and algorithms. And we'll talk about that. But for now, I want to focus on what happens when it all works as designed. When everything is functioning properly, there are no errors in implementation, when the application is performing exactly as intended. Because even so, as for so many other technologies, ethical issues can arise. As with previous talks so far in this course, I'm going to survey a number of cases where these sorts of issues arise, and that'll be the bulk of the presentation. And of course, on the course website, you can see all of these issues. If you go to Module 3 and click on the link that says All Issues, you can see all of them described. There are examples for them, and if you have more issues, you can add those. And if you can think of more examples or more articles addressing specific issues, you can add those as well. Okay then. The first is surveillance. And this is a pervasive application of artificial intelligence and analytics. It is good. It is very good at surveillance. Analytics both needs surveillance and it also produces surveillance. And you know, there's this symbiotic relation that happens here, and it's important to take note of that. Now, it's been observed, and is arguably true, that once surveillance becomes normal, it expands. It used to be rare to see video cameras recording public activities. Now we see them everywhere. We never used to have speed cameras on our highways. Now we do. So we're becoming more and more used to surveillance. People are recording everything with their phones, and our online activities are being tracked, and we just accept that as normal. And the use has expanded now, not just to preventing crime, which was the original intent, but for marketing, for demographics, for political purposes, etc. More and more uses, and not all of them are wrong. Surveillance for the purpose of ensuring that our airports are secure is arguably a good thing. But the expansion often takes it into areas where perhaps it should not be applied. And the reason for that is, as surveillance expands, it can impact our rights and freedoms. It can take away that aspect of our life, maybe freedom of speech, freedom of association, etc., that we think we used to have, but when we're under surveillance, constant surveillance, we get the feeling that we no longer have. And we'll look at that in a little bit of detail in some of these first few issues that we're covering. Tracking, for example, is an ongoing type of surveillance, and it's not just looking at who's passing through the public square or normal sorts of surveillance. Tracking is a specific application where you are followed by the surveillance system from place to place to place. And of course, we see that all the time in television shows where they sit down in front of the big wall of screens and they say, this camera picked up the person here, then that camera picked up the person there, and then they use their credit card here. We're not quite to that point yet, but clearly tracking is a capacity that analytics does excel at. We talked about the creation of identity graphs and the idea that we can associate distinct data points with the same continuous individual. And this seems a little weird to us. As Kevorkian says, it's one thing to be seen in public, it's another to be tracked by the state. And it's another to be tracked by advertising agencies, bill collectors, competitors, stalkers. Tracking seems to intrude on our quiet enjoyment of life. One of the things that is taken away from us is anonymity. It's arguable, and to a degree I would argue, that anonymity helps support the fundamental rights of privacy and freedom of expression. Certainly, people who are in less open societies that do not support freedom of expression, for example, rely on anonymity if they want to argue against the government, expose corruption, track down crime, and other acts of public virtue. People who fear religious persecution often depend on anonymity in order to continue practicing their faith. Many applications of analytics reduce or even eliminate anonymity. And there are two ways in which this happens. First, it makes it difficult to be anonymous. Again, identity graphs are able to construct persons out of distributed data. So even if you're being careful not to leave a data trail, you can still be identified as a distinct person by the commonalities of your interactions with different systems. But even more concerning, I think, is that the needs of analytics creates a social need to eliminate anonymity. We've seen a lot of arguments about, for example, the need to ensure that people use their real names in discussion forums. Facebook, for many years, had a very restrictive real names policy. It is almost impossible, I would say pretty much impossible, to access an online course or program using a pseudonym or by remaining anonymous. In fact, I did a presentation just last week on the ubiquitous requirement of online courses to require that participants register. So analytics is pushing back at our capacity to be anonymous, and this raises ethical issues. Another aspect of analytics is facial recognition. Again, there are different aspects, different ways in which this becomes ethical issues. Moyer writes, "What if a stranger could snap your picture on a sidewalk and then use an app to quickly discover your name, address, and other details?" Facial recognition, in other words, is the stalker's friend. It's also the crime detector's friend. So, it's and that raises its whole other set of ethical issues. But that's just one aspect of facial recognition. The other aspect is that it makes your face a public commodity that can be mined by analytics engines and used for purposes you may or may not support, and certainly with no compensation to you. For example, an application that simply scans faces either on the street or in web social network platforms can use those faces to create new faces, can use those faces to train face detection login systems, can use those faces to try to crack face detection login systems. So there's a question here about how much of your own self, your own public facing self, of which the face is only the most prominent, is the grist for analytics and AI applications. And I think there are ethical issues here, and certainly people, even people who have openly licensed their data for any use, commercial or non-commercial, are beginning to raise questions about this sort of use of their data. So analytics raises questions about privacy generally. And, it's important to note that privacy is more than just secrecy and confidentiality. It's more than just being anonymous or not being recognized when you're out walking on the street. It's about being left alone, as Kevorkian says. It's about not being liable to be called into account for anything, everything one says, does, or thinks. The conference that I'm participating in right now, and other conferences that I've seen, and indeed other meetings that I've been a part, say that we will not be recording this so that people can speak freely and without judgment. And the idea here is that if what everyone says is recorded, then what everyone says will be subject to judgment and scrutiny that goes far beyond what was ever intended by the person making the comment. Now, I have often argued against this, that confidentiality gives you permission to lie in private, or to speak the truth in private and lie in public. So, it's not an open and shut case here. But there is an argument to be made for privacy generally. I mean, we have walls around our house and not just windows, and that's for a reason. Similarly, even when data is collected properly, used properly, respects our privacy and all of that, we can have privacy failures. And this isn't a case where the analytics has failed. This is a case where the environment around the analytics has failed. The infrastructure around the analytics has failed. There are a couple of cases here. First of all, when the company in question breaches what is normally considered to be the ethical acquisition of data. The scanning of faces is a good example. Data mining public documents is a good example. I had an argument with Jesse Stommel a few months ago about companies that use AI to study tweets that are published on Twitter, and whenever the company is mentioned, to send a tweet in response. And Stommel says, these companies shouldn't be listening in on our private conversations simply for the purpose of marketing. Now, I push back against Stommel on this because I think that Twitter is a public domain and a company has as much right as anyone else to respond to somebody talking about it. On the other hand, I do understand his concern because it was never the intent of people talking about this company to be subject to this kind of scrutiny by the company. And so the use of the open, public, accessible data is considered to be not normally an ethical sort of use. And then, secondly, there are cases where the collection of data itself is of questionable ethical value. It may be legal, it may be working properly, but should we, for example, be collecting data about people's genetic backgrounds? Should we be collecting data about their private habits? Masters and Johnson collected data, but this was data voluntarily provided. Imagine a similar set of data was collected using the Amazon Echo or Alexa or the Google voice application, whatever it's called. That would be certainly questionable, possibly legal. And it's certainly a case where the analytics is working as intended, but it's not the sort of kind of data collection that we would consider ethical. Another area where issues of ethics arise for the successful use of analytics is in the area of assessments. And here I'm thinking specifically of assessment for the purposes of learning and development, but we could consider wider ranges of assessment, for example, job evaluations, performance evaluations, your driving habits by insurance companies, your health practices, and so on. It's a wide range of assessments that can be performed by artificial intelligence. So 3 points can be made here. First of all, people prefer to be assessed by a human. And I think that's partially because a human assessor might be seen as more forgiving, more understanding, more empathetic, because the human assessor understands the person being assessed rather better than the machine does. And I think it's because of the finality of machine assessments, and we'll get to that in the next few points here. What's more significant, though, is when the assessments go beyond the actual presented data. AI assessments can be made on the basis of predictive data. If you run analytics over how a person has done in their class, you can predict with reasonable accuracy how they will do on the final exam, all else being equal. There's going to be variation in that because of the pressure involved in writing a final exam. Nonetheless, it's very rare to see a D student in the class turn in an A performance on the final test, and vice versa. So, if we can make these predictions, why actually have the final exam at all? We could simply assess the person based on what we think they would do. And if you think that's a hypothetical, it actually came up during COVID when school years were cut short, and so assessments had to be made, grades had to be given based on what educators predicted their students would have done had they finished the term. And there was a lot of discussion about that and a lot of heated argument about that. More to the point, predictive data can be used more than just giving students a grade. It can be used to do unethical things, like minimize risk, for example. If your institution receives funding based on how well the students are doing, and you can predict how well one of your students is going to do, say next term or next year, well, then just drop that student from your enrollment in order to minimize the risk of losing funding based on assessment. This is what happens with insurance companies, where they look at what a person is likely to do when they're driving or whether they're likely to need health care or whatever. And it's certainly something that any ordinary application of artificial intelligence and analytics can do. Generally, institutions can treat high-risk individuals differently, but this differentiation doesn't always work to the advantage of the individual. It very often works to the disadvantage of the individual. Now, I mentioned this earlier. We'll come back and raise this now as a specific ethical issue, and that is the lack of discretion in machine-based analytics. We are all familiar with the idea that humans will make exceptions to the rules in view of extenuating circumstances. And I've put in there, the dog ate my homework. Now, that generally doesn't fly as an excuse, but the beauty of it is it could. If you could actually convince the teacher that the dog ate your homework, the teacher would presumably give you an extra day or 2 days in order to recover, well, not your original homework, that would be terrible, but the newly created homework, which may never have existed in the first place. That kind of exception typically would never be granted by an artificial intelligence. It's not so much that it sticks to the rules, because we're not dealing with rule-based artificial intelligence, but rather the AI considers all the factors it has access to in the first go-round, and there are no more facts to consider for a second go-round, so there's no possibility of appeal. By contrast, you can provide a human with additional facts that may appear to have nothing to do with the exercise in question, which may move them to make an exception to the rules. Now, usually what we say then is, well, we'll just include human oversight to these assessments, and that's great, and that's a good idea, but a lot of human oversight over time simply becomes rote procedure. After all, if the machine said, your passport is invalid, your passport is invalid. If the machine said it was a mistake, it was a mistake. And so the human oversight becomes just an empty procedural shell, a rubber stamp on what we all know must be correct. There is no appeal with analytics and artificial intelligence, and people don't like that. There's widespread aversion to being subject to these decisions. And this sort of appeal happens at multiple levels. On the one hand, we do want to have the capacity to appeal to a human, whether, and that's even true for human evaluators. If a person evaluates your essay, you want to be able to have the right to take that essay to an overseer, a department chair, whatever, and have it given a second assessment just to be sure that the first assessment was proper and fair. There's also the possibility of broader forms of assessment, which are called here society in the loop, where the assessment is evaluated broadly by society to make sure that fundamental rights, ethical values, preferences over trade-offs, etc. are being upheld. In other words, that the assessment process itself is subject to a wider range of social, not rules necessarily, but social interests and values. And what's important about the social assessment is that not everybody in society is going to have the same interests and values as the human assessor or the human controller. And certainly they will not have the same interests and values as the artificial intelligence engine. Until we have an AI that can look at an assignment from all perspectives and all values, these AIs are going to look at it from a specific point of view. And if you are only being assessed by that specific point of view without appeal, then there's a good argument that that assessment is unfair. Moving to a newer topic, AI systems now can manipulate content, and we've probably all heard of deep fakes. We have a couple examples here on the screen. One is face swapping. That's where you take Justin Bieber's face and put it on top of a photo of Justin Trudeau. So it looks like we have Prime Minister Bieber Trudeau. On the other hand, we can take an existing face and manipulate that face so that a person who's frowning might be made to look like they're smiling, or a person who's smiling might be made to look like they're angry and raging with profanities and all of that. Deep fakes are possible not only for images, but now also for videos as well, and there are numerous examples of celebrities made to do things that those celebrities never did. These are a challenge, arguably, and the U.S. Government Accountability Office says this, a looming challenge for privacy, democracy, and national security. And the reason why they're a challenge is because we are not able to easily distinguish between real content and fake content. Fake content created by an AI can be rendered almost undetectable, which means that we can be led into believing things about people and events that are simply not true. And that's an ethical issue. Taking this one step further, artificial intelligence systems can also be used to manipulate the users themselves. We saw an example where the Cambridge Analytica data from Facebook was used to perform experiments to try to stimulate certain emotions on the part of Facebook users. We now have AI-driven social bots that send car or skincare advertisements. They start chatting with you and, as reported by Paul and Possard, actually experimenting on you to test what content will elicit the strongest reactions. Now, this is arguably unethical behavior. It's giving an unfair advantage, it could be said, to the machine or to the advertiser to create a conversational situation where the user is unable to detect or defend against the manipulation that is taking place. It's kind of like, a machine fast talker. And, while we can recognize a fast talker, in a human when we run across them. It's a lot harder to detect an artificial intelligence because they're better able to disguise what they are, and they're able to be much more subtle in their use of manipulative tactics. Similarly, analytics engines can be used for micro-targeting, and what this is the use of descriptive analytics to identify different clusters or categories of people who are influenced or believing different things, and then to create advertisements or political messages aimed at that particular class or demographic and designed in such a way as to appeal to that demographic. It makes advertising especially very hard to evaluate because most of this advertising is not seen by evaluators. There are things like the Ad Standards Council, which require that advertisements be truthful and honest and non-manipulative, but if the advertisement's only being seen by a subsegment of society, maybe 3,000 people, this never surfaces, and there's no way for people to tell that the advertiser is saying one thing to this group of people and another contradictory thing to that group of people. There's no requirement of consistency in their messaging. And so this raises ethical issues, first of all, in the classification of people as being part of this group or that group, and then secondly, in the targeting of messages and the tailoring of messages to those groups. It's interesting to note that Google's new Chorus system, the system that's supposed to replace cookies, is this kind of micro-targeted system where people are classified into these different categories, and then as they go from place to place, they're not identified as an individual, they're identified as a member of that category and advertised to accordingly. This is another version of microtargeting and is subject to the same sorts of arguments and concerns, which may explain why Google has delayed it for 2 years. Discrimination is in general a problem with the correct application of analytics and artificial intelligence. Because after all, the point of a lot of AI in analytics is specifically to treat people differently. Now that's not always wrong. I can think of many cases where it's right. You don't want to treat a French-speaking person to education in English, or Urdu, or Farsi. So people should be educated in their appropriate language. You don't want to rely on visual images exclusively for a student who is blind. Again, obviously. So, and there are many other reasons to differentiate between one person and another person. But there are cases where this kind of differentiation, this kind of discrimination, can become problematic. Discriminatory pricing, for example, adjusting insurance rates based not on what a person does, but on their class or race or geographic location. This is known as redlining. Race-based marketing, showing one class of product to one race and another lower class of product to another race, is problematic. Tailored propaganda, similarly, different messages for different classes of people, appealing to these classes on the basis of class membership rather than on the basis of the message or the product being advertised. All of these raise ethical issues. All of these ethical issues are augmented and greatly amplified by the use of analytics in producing these kinds of discrimination. And finally, fear and anxiety. The thing with analytics is we know we're being watched. We know we're always being watched. And that could lead in general to what has become known as Fitbit anxiety. Here's the idea. You have a Fitbit, it's your watch maybe, and you use it to track your activity, you use it to track your heart rate and other factors, just to try to motivate yourself into better fitness. But as you follow this data, you become more and more anxious, either about not being successful in perhaps lowering your heart rate, or the requirement to always be keeping up with what the Fitbit recommends. So you have this case where the Fitbit is almost taking over and undermining your sense of self-agency and autonomy. And the argument is that analytics in general can produce this sort of fear and anxiety. The surveillance, the tracking, the marketing. It's like when you're watching Netflix and you're thinking, I'd like to watch that Western, but I'm afraid to click on that Western because I don't want to be served suggestions for Westerns for the rest of my life. That sort of thing. So those are the issues, the ethical issues that arise when analytics is working properly. There may be other issues, and of course you can add them to the website. There may be other examples. There are many other examples of these issues out there in the wider world, and I encourage you to look for them and perhaps add them. This is technology working properly that raises ethical issues. It's not the first technology that raises ethical issues when it works properly, and it won't be the last. It's one of those things where, we don't always know what we've created when we've created. And that's why, arguably, we should certainly be attentive to what could happen if we are successful in our development intentions. That's it for this video. And I'll be talking about more types of issues, ethical issues raised by AI and analytics in education and learning in the videos to follow. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and thank you for joining me. I'm Stephen Downs.